So in this webinar, we're going to talk about what the barriers are for neurodivergent staff. We're going to explore solutions to remove the barriers. We're going to discuss what neuroinclusion looks like, and then we'll have times for question and answers at the end. So who am I? I'm Dan. I'm qualified social worker, trained as a learning disabilities nurse, and I recently graduated as got my MBA. So I've spent my entire career working in services for neurodivergent individuals. During that time, I've got 20 plus years experience of management. And I received my own diagnosis of autism last year at the age of 42. And as part of that, um, as part of that diagnosis, when I started to look for resources for neurodivergent managers, for neurodivergent staff, I realised there was a complete lack of those. And this is one of the reasons for setting up Managing on the Spectrum. Um, and I've always been passionate about inclusion. It's really important that we address the barriers for neurodivergent individuals and talk about how we can find ways free for them. So in terms of the webinar, do what works for yourself. If you want to have the camera on, that's fine. If you want to have it off, that's absolutely fine. You can introduce yourselves in the chat if you so desire. And if you want to listen, that's fine as well. The things I just talk about are really kind of important because one of the big barriers for neurodivergent people is that lack of psychological safety. So when meetings insist that people have their cameras on or they have to speak or they can't write their views, then that in itself is a huge barrier for some neurodivergent staff. So I've been in meetings where people have been insisted in having the cameras on. But as I say, that in itself can be a barrier. So when we're thinking about how we work with neurodivergent people, it's massively important that we address those one of the barriers. I think it's important to define what neurodiversity is. It's a word that's used a lot and is sometimes misused, in my opinion. Fundamentally, neurodiversity is the natural variation in how human brains function. So every single person that is, was, and ever will be is neurodiverse because no two human brains are the same. However, when we think about neurodivergence, we think about that there are people whose brains function diverge from what is considered to be normal. And so that's what neurodivergent is. And there's a range of diagnoses for neurodivergence, including autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's, and many others as well. So it's vast. Rough estimates are about 1 in 5 people are neurodivergent, so 20%. So if we look at, in the workforce, that's going to be quite a significant number for most workforces. And yeah, saying, my own view is that that number is underreported. And you see biases within, there's still underdiagnosis of autism despite what's being shared in the media. We see that there's underdiagnosis of ADHD, there's underdiagnosis of neurodivergence in females, and there's other other intersectionality as well with neurodivergence. You could ask yourself, that's all well and good, Dan, but so what? Why is that important? Why should we care about that? And there's several reasons really. The fact is that just 31% of neurodivergent individuals are in paid employment compared to 54% of disabled people overall and 75% of non-disabled people. So we see that huge disparity in the within the workforce. And that disparity starts at the very beginning in education. Education continues to fail a lot of neurodivergent people. And that means that you have neurodivergent individuals leaving education without those qualifications, and then that in itself leads to barriers in the workforce. Um, we see high rates of burnout and masking and sickness within neurodivergent people as well, because of that lack of support. We also know that inclusion boosts innovation and loyalty and well-being for people. So we see that it's hugely, there are huge benefits to neuro inclusion. So that as well is another um, reason for kind of why neuro inclusion matters. There are lots and lots of barriers. These are a few of them. Sensory overload, lighting is can be quite awful. Fluorescent lights, the harm of those lights, they can be very bright. They can be very overstimulating. I personally struggle. I hate going into offices or any buildings, supermarkets, any buildings like that where you have fluorescent lights. I find them really kind of overstimulating. Noise as well. My brain struggles to filter out the noise. So if I'm in the office, I will hear everything apart from the person who's speaking to me. Ironically, I get so distracted by what's going on around me. So I always chuckle when people say, "Let's go and have a quiet drink in a cafe," because that's horrific. I can hear literally everything, and kind of that kind of has an impact on me. And open plan offices, people are loud, people are um, they seem to lack a understanding of the others around them. Unclear communication. So when people, yeah, unclear, ambiguous communication. Have you got 5 minutes? But they really mean half an hour. Giving vague instructions is a massive barrier for people, as is inflexible working. Working arrangements. I get that in some working workplaces, it's really difficult for people to work flexibly. But there are many others that there isn't, there isn't that challenge. So the insistence that everyone needs to be on the office 5 days a week. Why is that? The insistence that we work 9 till 5. Why is that? If my natural algorithm is that I'm more productive in the morning or later at night, why can I not have that flexibility? Um, and yeah, unwritten rules as well. There's just so many. I've put a few here. Being direct is perceived as being rude. I've been accused of that in the past, but actually, if you ask me an honest question, you're going to get an honest answer. So if you didn't want an honest answer, then kind of reframe about how you're going to ask that question. And like having lunch by yourself, being judged as antisocial and within within work politics. So, I do go and have lunch by myself. I need to. If I've been in meetings all day with people, I need to have that time to myself to defragment and to think about process what's going on around me and plan for the next meeting. So that's kind of that's really important. And that goes beyond the workplace as well. There are somebody's turning 50 and you don't go to their party, then that's frowned upon. But why is that? And there are other examples of those barriers for neurodivergent individuals. So this can have a significant impact on staff. Masking is the suppression of neurodivergent tendencies. So don't fidget, make eye contact, stop talking about your special interest. Things like that. That can all have an impact on people. And when you're doing that day in day out, it does lead to exhaustion. So that has a massive impact, results in people feeling unsafe because for a lot of neurodivergent people, the world and the environment can seem quite hostile. So it's really important that we have those, that people do feel safe and that people feel able to, kind of flourish at work. Not being misunderstood. I feel like I spend my life being misunderstood by people. I feel that, when I'm talking I'm almost speaking a different language to people, and people don't quite understand what I say. Conversely, I don't often understand what people are telling me either. So there's another theory called double empathy, which is when double empathy argues that if you have two neurodivergent people together, they will understand each other And if you have two neurodivergent, neurotypical people, they'll understand each other, but the neurotypical people won't understand the neurodivergent people, and vice versa. So there's theory called double empathy, and so that kind of feeds into that. Lack of promotion opportunities. Now, I do a whole training session around inclusive recruitment because actually recruitment is a terribly kind of challenging process for a lot of neurodivergent people, from that first application form to interviews to the onboarding process. So that in itself can be a barrier. And then once you've got in there, you know, the interview process is not really set for neurodivergent people. You're often going into a meeting or several meetings, depending on what job you're going for. You're having questions fired at you, you're having to respond, you're speaking to people you're not familiar with in unfamiliar environments. So that can have a massive impact on people. And so all of this can then make people feel quite low about themselves, not surprisingly, because of all this pressure that's on them. So it's really important to kind of understand this. It doesn't have to be this way, and that's kind of the point of this webinar and the point of managing on the spectrum. There is another way it can be positive, and what inclusion looks like is clear communication. So having meetings that have agendas for them, creating flexible working opportunities, and even if the flexible working is you have to be on a site. Well, can somebody do long days? Can people do condensed hours? Can they do split hours if that's what works for them and works for the employer? Um, Meetings that include everybody, and that doesn't mean just shining a spotlight on the person that hasn't spoken. Actually, think about how does it include people? Creating opportunities for feedback, and making sure that that feedback is absolutely tangible. Setting up staff networks. I recently set up a staff network for neurodivergent individuals, and it's a space for neurodivergent staff and allies, so people who are not neurodivergent but want to support neurodivergent colleagues, talk about their experiences, make recommendations, changes. It's really important that these networks have senior management buy-in. It will not work if it's just done in isolation. It needs to have that buy-in. So that's massively important. Visible representation of neurodivergent individuals in leadership roles. We don't really know how many neurodivergent people are in leadership roles because a lot of people are worried about disclosing their neurodivergence. When I've been telling people about mine, I've worked with colleagues who are neurodivergent, but they're worried to share that because they're worried about the employment opportunities they might have. And if you do all this, then people feel safe. And when people feel safe, we flourish. People do not flourish in situations and hostile environments, regardless of whether you're neurodivergent or neurotypical. So that's really important to do this. And as I say, it is doable. We're not talking about massive changes that are needed here. It starts with leadership. It has to be with leadership. So listening without judgment, not saying when somebody discloses that they are autistic or an ADHD, oh yeah, everyone's ADHD or everyone's autistic, because they're not. Only 1% of the population are autistic, about 3% of the population are ADHD. So when people say that, it's completely invalidating. Not everybody is autistic. I think the world would be a slightly better place, personally speaking, if it was, but they're not. We're not autistic. Solutions need to be co-designed with neurodivergent staff. So, the whole nothing about us without us, that has to be essential. Neurotypical people can understand neurodivergent experiences. Of course they can, but I have that lived experience of being autistic. I know what it's like to work in these places as an autistic person. I'm not trying to tell somebody's the autistic experience. Conversely, I'm not dyslexic. So, yes, I have an understanding of dyslexia, but actually, if you wanted to understand what's the impact on dyslexic people in the workplace, then it's important to listen to dyslexic people as well. And that's really important. And again, role modeling neuro-inclusive practice. So, you know, if you're going into a room, asking people where they feel comfortable, the tradition is that the person chairing the meeting sits in the middle. that actually, what if I don't want to sit in the middle because I get overwhelmed by people around me? What if I'd rather sit at the corner of the room or the end of the room so that I can better manage the sensory stimuli? So that's what neuro inclusion is. Conversely, you know, if something can be done on a virtual meeting, not insisting everybody needs to go into the office, these are tangible things that do not cost any money, but make a massive difference for neurodivergent individuals. Actually, know what I've done there. It's quite funky. Okay. So again, it's not everybody, kind of neurodivergent staff can make changes themselves. Naming your strengths is a really kind of key bit. And there's a wonderful book, The Power of Neurodiversity, by a wonderful chap called Thomas Armstrong. And in that, he talks about neurodivergent strength. And there's a checklist, and that's really important, so thinking about what we do well. Um, in the UK, there's an Access to Work program which provides reasonable adjustments for people in work, and this can range from coaching and mentoring through to having Dragon software for dyslexic people and other kind of interventions. So that's available. Understanding your rights under the UK Equality Act, you do not need a formal diagnosis to be covered. You are, and this has been tested in case law. Last year, there was a case in Northern Ireland where an autistic successfully took his employer to employment tribunal, and and um, his employer had not enacted reasonable adjustments because he didn't have a formal diagnosis, but actually he proved evidence that he was impacted and they found in his favour. Um, Celebrate your successes and wins, and they don't need to be huge, fantastic wins. It's not about running a marathon. It's actually, I advocated for myself today. I didn't feel guilty for saying to somebody I wanted to have lunch by myself. I took fidgets into work, or I wore loops, or whatever, the small wins, because again, often the neurodivergent experience is quite negative. If we do this, then everybody benefits. It's not a case of neurodivergent people being treated differently from neurotypical people. It's about actually everyone having the same opportunities. So we know that organizations that promote neuro-inclusivity, you see enhanced collaboration, you see improved employee well-being and retention. We see greater empathy and effectiveness across all teams. And if we wanted to talk about myth busting, which again is another training session I do, autistic people do experience empathy. We just demonstrate it in a different way to what neurotypical people do. In fact, if you want to get really scientific around it, sometimes we experience hyper empathy. In fact, we are so in tune to what's going on that we feel the emotions of everybody in the room. So that's really important. We see people feel more comfortable and more happy to disclose and share because again, neurodivergence does not happen in isolation. So that's really important. And then through that, we see better performance. Businesses want their employees to perform well ultimately, and that doesn't matter if you work in the NHS or the private sector. We want performance. So it supports that. And then you have reduced absenteeism and improved morale. So everybody wins from this. It's really important that we kind of, we highlight this. That's it from me. I will come back to any questions in a minute, but I don't want to stop sharing my screen. So my next webinar will be on the 11th of November, and I'm going to be focusing on masking, understanding the impact of masking on neurodivergent people at work. It's going to be a lunchtime webinar, so people have to take times out of their evenings to join me in. Masking is a massively important subject, and as I've alluded to in this webinar, it has a real impact on people. So it's important that we discuss it and think about how we can support people to unmask safely.